So now that I got a handle on the basic interface of Unity, I want to take a crack at translating an early island sketch into the 3D environment using the terrain tools inside Unity. And before I get started with this process, I just want to jump into one of my assets folder. I'm going to go into my game design folder. I'd created a map folder, and this is just where I'm saving some of the sketches or the references for my map project. And I'm just going to pop open my early scan, and I just have this basic shape. It's a basic C shape here with a volcano island in the middle and a little string of islands off to the top right. And I'm going to just try to reference just really quickly the shape of this when I'm inside Unity. I'm going to get started by creating a terrain object, and I can do that by going to the terrain pull-down menu, and I'll choose create terrain. When I create a terrain object, I get this two-dimensional plane inside Unity. I'll just zoom out just a little bit so we get a better sense of what we're looking at here. And now before I start to implement this terrain and explore some of the tools that are available, I do want to set the resolution of the terrain just a little bit. And I can do that by going to the terrain pull-down menu and choose to set the resolution. I'm basically resizing my terrain or getting a sense of what the actual size of it is. Now at this point, the size of the terrain is going to be kind of an abstract concept. But when we pull up the set resolution dialog box, you can see that we have a terrain width, a height, and a length. And at this point, I'm going to set the width of my terrain. I'm going to reduce it from 2000 to 1500. Now, when Unity presents you with a value, it's not just a generic unit, it's referring to meters. And it's very important that we keep things to relative scale, because when we start interacting with the physics engine, inside Unity, it's all based on the relative scale of things. So we definitely want to model things accurately, we want to build things accurately, and have them at a relative scale to real-world objects. That way the physics engine will function properly, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as needed. So I've set my terrain width to about 1500 just to reduce that value. I have a terrain height value. I'm going to let that default, and I'm going to set the terrain length to 1,000 meters. Everything else I'm going to let default. We'll take a closer look at some of these other values when we start applying textures, and we'll see how it relates to our actual terrain object. And I'm going to set the resolution. Now when I do, you can see my terrain gets a little bit smaller, and I'm just going to recompose my view a little bit so that I'm looking more or less so that the x-axis, or the red axis, runs left and right, and the z-axis runs forward and backwards. And I'm just going to flatten out my view just a little bit so I'm looking down my y-axis. Okay, and at this point you may even want to click on the y-axis to get an absolute flat view of your terrain for a moment. Now I'm just going to tilt this view a little bit because we'll get more dramatic results if we can see this in a slight perspective, but I am keeping a relatively flat view. Now the terrain object is a unique object inside Unity. When we create a terrain object, we get this object that we can influence, and we see that we have a terrain object in our hierarchy view. With that terrain object selected, we have these different components that we can influence, and there's a unique component called a terrain script component that's attached to this terrain. And inside the terrain script component, there are a set of tools that we can start to use, and I'm going to start with this first tool. When I select it, I can see that I have the raised lower terrain brush selected. Just beneath that, I have these different brushes that I can use, and these brushes start with a soft-edged brush and move to a hard-edged brush, and then we move into a more grungier brush form. So I'm going to start with just a simple soft-edged brush. With that brush selected, I can influence the size and opacity of my brush, and for the sake of the demo, I'm just going to bump my brush size up to a pretty large brush, and when I roll it over to my landscape, you'll see that I get this blue hotspot over top of my landscape. And this is the area of influence for this brush. And at this point, this tool tells us that we can raise and lower the terrain height using this tool. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the paintbrush and I'm just going to quickly paint. And as you do, you can see that I'm actually pulling the terrain up, or I'm adding height to that terrain. And I'll just click and paint around, and I'm just kind of experimenting with this brush. And you can see that it's lifting the terrain up. And to get a more dramatic view, I'll just kind of tip this terrain down just a little bit, and I'll zoom in on it. Now, I'm not getting real dramatic results at this point, and so I'm going to bump up the brush size, and I'm going to bump up the opacity of the brush, so the strength at which it influences the terrain. And I'll just click and drag, and you can see that as I let my mouse just kind of hover, that terrain continues to increase in height. And so I'm actually sculpting and kind of pulling this terrain up from a flat two-dimensional shape. And now as I orbit around, I can start to get a sense that I'm creating some topology to my two-dimensional plane. So I'm starting to create this environment, and I'm starting to sculpt and pull the terrain up. Now, as the tool suggests here, when I look at and have selected the raise lower terrain height, it tells me that I can click to raise the terrain. And if I hold down the shift key, I get the inverse of the brush. And so I'm actually pushing the terrain back down to its 0 height. Now I can go back in and paint. If I don't want such dramatic results, I can reduce the brush size and the opacity, and I can get a different effect of the tool that I've selected. I can also use these different brushes to create a more textured kind of terrain, or I can combine the two by actually pressing and pushing down some of the terrain that I created. So I can create terrain by sculpting it, pushing it up, lifting it, and smashing it back down. So experiment with this first raise lower height terrain tool. And in the next presentation, we'll take a look at the rest of the tools in the terrain script editor. We'll catch up in the next presentation.